Hola, buenos días. Thanks a lot for inviting me. And yes, I was asked to talk today about a survey paper I wrote this year on the political economy of AI. And so that's what I'm going to do. And if there are any questions during the talk, feel free to interrupt anytime. I might not see the chat, but just unmute or whatever works on your end. And so this is a bit of an overview talk. Now, if you've read the news in recent years, you have probably come across many headlines, such as the one in this slide. So there's been a lot of discussion about different potential problems that might be caused by AI and different kind of normative concerns and social impacts. So there are discussions like the first headline here about algorithmic discrimination, the fairness and bias of algorithmic decision-making. There's a lot of discussions about data collection, data privacy, data property rights, and how to regulate them and how that impacts AI. There are a lot of discussions, especially coming from more like the Silicon Valley type on so-called value alignment, for this question of what happens if the machine doesn't optimize what humans want, and there is a conflict between man and machine. There is discussions about explainability and accountability of algorithmic decision-making. There are discussions about the impact of AI on the labor market, on economic inequality, on skill-bias technical change, labor market polarization, and related hypotheses. And so that's kind of like a large discussion that's taking place right now within academia, but also within the wider public, within the media, and so on. And these concerns have prompted all kinds of political agencies to try and think about regulation of artificial intelligence. So for instance, in the European Union, there's discussion of an Artificial Intelligence Act by the European Council. In the United States, there is now this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, and there are many other similar attempts in different parts of the world. And now this can be a pretty confusing and multifaceted debate, right? So already mentioned, there's like all these different normative and social aspects of AI that are being discussed about fairness, discrimination, and inequality, about privacy and data property rights, about value alignment, about explainability, accountability, about automation, and so on. And these debates are conducted also in different academic subfields and different contexts. So there are lawyers discussing about this. They might, for instance, care a lot about explainability and accountability. There are philosophers discussing about this, computer scientists, sociologists, political scientists, economists, and others. And so what I'm going to try to do today, and what I'm trying to do in this survey paper, is to develop a somewhat more systematic way of getting a unified perspective on these different questions and have a systematic way to normatively assess the impacts of AI and possible attempts to regulate AI. Now you might ask, well, sorry, not yet, but so here's kind of the key summary of how I think about these questions, and I'm going to elaborate on these takeaways for the rest of the talk. So the first thing I'm going to emphasize is, well, what is AI? And in essence, pretty much all of AI is about automated decision-making to maximize some measurable objective. And so that covers many different sub-branches of AI and different approaches to machine learning and to other methods for implementing AI systems. But at the heart of it, all of them are essentially optimization systems that measure something that can be that's kind of denoted a reward or a loss function, and that's being optimized. And now the question is, who picked this objective, right? Because when we think about now what happens in society is, when there are many different people have different objectives, they have different resources, there's inequality, there's value conflicts, and so on. And so what that means is that any automated decision-making system, just like any policy more generally, will generate winners and losers if we evaluate it in terms of the objectives that people actually have. And so when we want to make a normative assessment about any AI system in whatever context, then in general, we will have to trade off these individual gains and losses. So we will have to think about how do we assess like individual losses and gains, and if there are some winners and some losers, how do we kind of balance them against each other? And what this kind of two perspectives open up, right? There one perspective saying AI is maximizing some measurable objective. The other perspective saying normative evaluations of what's happening in society are about the different objectives that different people have and about trading them off. Well, that opens the question, how do we bring the two together? So how do we align algorithmic objectives and social welfare? And there is no reason in any particular like privately controlled system that those two should coincide in any meaningful way. And so what I'm then going to argue for is that in order to make this technological advance beneficial from the perspective of society, we need democratic control. We need democratic control of the objectives that are being optimized. And in order to get there, we need democratic control of the input into AI system, which includes the algorithms, which includes the data that are being fed into them, and which also includes the computational infrastructure. So the only way ultimately to make sure that what's being optimized is what we care about as a society is to give actual control rights to those who are affected by these automated decisions. Now you might ask, how is all of this economics? Like, why is an economist telling you about this? And I would argue that economists are actually fairly well positioned to talk about these things, because in some sense, the discipline sits at an intersection between different things. On the one hand, as economists, we are trained to use the language of optimization and to use the language of probability, especially in microeconomic theory. And that's something that's very much the same language that AI and machine learning and statistics use. Right? So they are all concerned about decision problems, which are formulated in the language of optimization and probability. But on the other hand, there's something that economists do, which AI and ML in general don't do, which is think about the fact that we live in a society and in an economy where are different people, there are multiple agents, and these multiple agents have unequal endowments, different resources, there's inequality, they have conflicting interests, and often they also have private information. And so that kind of opens up a whole set of questions, which in some sense you cannot see if you think exclusively in the framework of single agent decision theory and optimization like standard machine learning does. And so in particular, in order to think about the normative evaluation of AI and the social impact of AI, we have the toolkit of welfare economics, of social choice theory, and of causal inference, which are very familiar to economists and which provide useful frameworks in order to think about the impact of AI. Now, to make things a little bit more specific, right? So I set out this like 4 key takeaways, where on the one hand, we have the algorithms maximizing some measurable objective, which I'm going to denote in blue in my slides. And on the other hand, we have something that we might care about as a society more broadly, which I'm going to denote in red on these slides. And so, for instance, in the context of social networks, think Facebook or Twitter or some other social network or the search engine content selection, those are big tech companies that by and large, their primary objective is to maximize ad revenue, right? That's really what the algorithms of Facebook they are designed for, is to maximize clicks on ads and then to show those ads that are likely to be clicked on and for which the ad buyer has set a high price for a click. So their goal is to maximize ad revenue by keeping you on the platform and by making you click on ads. But that's a different objective from other things we might care about in society, right? So social networks play a big role now in the public sphere and in the democratic process. And so the impact of algorithms that are good for ad revenue might be bad for a public debate and democracy. Or you might be concerned about the impact of social media on teenage mental health, on body image issues and other related questions. Again, a different objective from what the objective is of the tech companies who are designed to maximize ad revenue. Or think about big online selling platforms. So they are primarily designed to maximize monopoly profits, maybe subject to the legal constraints that they don't want to cross. But again, monopoly profits through price setting, either on the consumer side or in practice more relevant at this point on the seller side to these platforms. It's a very different question from caring about consumer welfare, also the welfare about small scale sellers on these platforms or the sellers of gig work. So again, not the same objective, and you might have to think about how we get the two together. Or if you think about the use of algorithms in in hiring, which is very common at this point in large companies in the HR departments, where CVs and job applications are scanned automatically and filtered automatically for candidates that might then be invited for an interview. And again, the goal here by construction is to maximize profits, which includes things like screening workers for the likelihood that they might join a union and screening out workers who could join a union. Again, different from other things we might care about as a society, like equity, social mobility, or also worker voice and participation. And you could provide many more examples where there's no natural reason why the objectives being chosen by, say, big tech companies for maximizing using by AI are the same objectives we should care about as a society. Now, here's what I'm planning to do for the rest of the talk. So the first two parts here are essentially review. So I'm going to talk a little bit what is AI, right? I mean, you are going to hear about AI every day in the newspaper now, but again, it can be quite confusing what it is. And I don't know, if you're on the more technical side, if you follow something like the archive feed, right, you see like literally hundreds of papers every week published with some new AI methods, and it can be confusing what unifies them. But at their essence, I'm going to argue there's kind of a common thread to a lot of these things, which again amount to maximizing some measurable rewards based on some available data and some way of dealing with the uncertainty that comes with these data. And so from this slightly more black box perspective, you can get a good understanding for what these things are doing without having to understand all the details of what's going on under the hood. So that's the first part here, is what is AI? The second part is talking about kind of the normative framework and the economics of this. So how do we think about social welfare? How do we think about normative evaluations in kind of a social welfare, social choice, or consequentialist framework? And then relatedly, and a bit more from a political theory point of view, there's the question of how do we bring the two things together, the objectives of AI and normatively desirable social objectives or social welfare. And so that raises the question of who are potential agents of change, where I'm going to argue that most of the current ethics and AI discourse is explicitly or implicitly just addressing corporate engineers or corporate managers, but really there are many more agents out there that we could talk to when we talk about the ethics and social impact of AI, right? There's consumer advocates, there's unions and worker advocates, there's political parties, there's policymakers, there's lawyers, there's journalists, there's many other representatives of stakeholders who might be impacted. And so we should think more broadly about who the addressee of debates about the ethics of AI should be, and how to jumpstart the democratic debate about this. And so that's the first half of the talk, is providing this background, and then the second half I'm going to take these frameworks and I'm going to use them to talk one by one about these 5 different domains about the ethics of AI that I started out with. So I'm going to try and use them to provide a more or less unified perspective on debates about fairness, discrimination, inequality, about privacy and data property rights, about value alignment, about explainability, and about automation. All right. So now, what is AI? And again, I'm arguing here that pretty much all of AI systems are systems for automated decision-making that maximize some measurable objectives. So here, for instance, I have put a quote from one of the leading textbooks on AI, which gives a definition of what a rational agent is, and then says AI is about the construction of rational agents. And it really reads surprisingly similar to what you would read in an economics textbook of what a rational agent is. So they define a rational agent as one who selects actions that are expected to maximize the performance measure, right? So the notion of reward, or with a sign flip, a notion of loss. And to do that, given the evidence provided by the percept sequence, so that's kind of the data available to the algorithm, and whatever other built-in knowledge the agent has to begin with. And so this is a very general definition of AI that covers many different branches, historical and current. By far the leading approach at this point is so-called machine learning, right? So machine learning is essentially the construction of rational agents in this sense, but based on statistical inference. But machine learning, just to emphasize that it's not the only approach to AI. So it's the one that's dominating more recently, but historically other approaches have dominated. So for instance, in the 80s, there's been a lot of work on expert systems and automated reasoning, right? So the idea was to, in some sense, hand code human knowledge, expert knowledge into large databases with a certain structure, and then have ways to do automated logical reasoning bits and deeds to come up with new conclusions. And it turned out that approach had some interesting results, but didn't get that far. And one of the main reasons is that it's not really scalable in the same way that machine learning is, because it really requires human experts to enter the knowledge and to be able to encode it in a useful way. Whereas machine learning, you can just scale with the amount of data you have. And at this point, as you have all the data from the internet, essentially, that you can feed into these systems, you can just operate orders of magnitude on a larger scale relative to what you could do with like hand coding human knowledge. Okay, so that's kind of a very general definition of AI and machine learning. Now let me give you a little bit of an overview of different subfields of machine learning. So the one that economists have probably paid by far the most attention to is so-called supervised learning. Supervised learning is really just about prediction, but you have some outcome Y and you have some features X. Features is really the same thing as a covariate in econometric terminology, and you're trying to predict the outcome Y. And so what it means is you're trying to find some function G of X, which is in some meaningful way close to the outcome Y, where close is measured by some loss function. So the goal here then is to minimize the expected loss over new draws of X and Y, right? So to minimize expected prediction errors. And there are a number of key ideas that machine learning emphasizes on how to do this type of regression task. So these ideas include things like variance bias trade-offs, right? So you have to be smart about, if you're too flexible in your model, then your estimation has a lot of variance, even if it has low bias. So it's called overfitting. If your model is too restrictive, or if you're regularizing too much, then you have little variance, but a lot of bias, and it's what's called underfitting. And good supervised learning methods have to land in the sweet spot between those two. And that's typically done using methods such as cross-validation, where you try to evaluate the out-of-sample fit, the out-of-sample predictive performance, and then pick tuning parameters, such as the flexibility of the model or the amount of penalization or regularization, in order to optimally trade off variance and bias, or kind of more general versions of that. And this prediction paradigm or supervised learning paradigm is really surprisingly general, right? So that covers a lot of applications of machine learning that you might think about. So it covers the ones that have had big successes, like image recognition, right? So here, give the computer a picture and ask them to tell, is this a chihuahua or a muffin? Or so then the label chihuahua or muffin would be the outcome Y, and the image pixels would be the features X. Or voice recognition, right? Where you're trying to map like a recording of a voice into like a text transcription, or automatic translation, where the features X are text in one language and the outcome Y is text in another language. It also covers a lot of the applications of machine learning that are more immediately socially consequential and are emphasized in the discussions about the social impact of AI, such as automated evaluation of job candidates or university applicants, say based on CVs or based on high school transcripts and so on. It includes bail setting in courts, so that's, I guess, more specific to the US criminal justice system, where a lot of algorithms are being used to predict future crime and then to incarcerate people accordingly. It includes credit scoring and some more traditional exercise where banks predict credit risk and allocate availability of credit accordingly. And it also includes a lot of the commercial applications of machine learning and AI, such as predicting what users are going to click on what ads, or what content is going to keep users on a platform and keep doom scrolling. So yeah, it looks, when you just look at it like that, right, it looks like simple and familiar. It's just a regression, but it has applications in many different domains. And so one approach to supervised learning that has been particularly successful in the last few years is so-called deep learning. It's really just one way to think about it is just a way of running regressions with particular functional forms. but it turns functional forms that are very complicated and very expressive. And so the functions G that are used in deep learning are functions that you can think of as being built from many different more primitive functions that are plugged into each other. And these more primitive functions are then interpreted as neurons. Right? In any deep learning talk, you're obliged to show a picture like that, where if you input data and then they're fed through some functions, then you get like the output of those are the hidden layers or intermediate layers, which are fed into new functions and so on until finally you get to the output layer. And so this approach has been particularly successful for very large and rich data sets. Right? So it's not useful if you run like a classic Minster regression of Bayesian education. Deep learning is not going to buy you very much. But if you're trying to construct like a language model, like say GPT, that's used in ChatGPT, then this has been extremely successful, right? So the GPT says like a supervised learning model, where essentially you're trying to predict the next word on the internet that would follow for a given text that you've seen so far. Right, so it's regressing next word and the previous word, but that's a very complicated and nonlinear prediction problem, and that's where deep learning and more recently, particularly in the form of so-called transformers, has been really successful. Or again, image recognition, knowing that it's a sloth or a chocolate croissant, is something where deep learning typically is going to be a lot more successful than more traditional regression methods like your linear OLS regression or logit regression or whatever it is. Now, so that's prediction. That's where a lot of discussions of machine learning and AI stop, but really prediction typically is then the input for decisions that are made based on these predictions. And so one leading class for that would be targeted treatment assignment. So in targeted treatment assignment, we don't directly think about predicting an outcome. We think about mapping features X, or covariates X, into a decision that's unit specific, right? So they think about deciding which patient gets a certain drug or doesn't, or which top candidate gets a certain training program or doesn't, and so on. And so then you might care about things like maximizing average outcomes through the choice of a treatment assignment function. And so again, this is particularly relevant in the typical socially impactful uses of machine learning, like the selection of top candidates, like credit scoring and credit, like student admissions, like the allocation of medical treatment. And so again, here we have some measurable objective function. In this case, it's implicitly a causal objective, which is like how do you maximize average outcomes through the allocation of a treatment or of treatment probabilities more generally. And all of the applications or frameworks we talked about so far are cases of so-called offline learning. Offline here means has the technical meaning that it's kind of the data are given and then you, based on the data, you make a decision, and that's the end of the story in some sense. But many practical settings are settings of so-called online learning. Online here again in the technical sense, so this doesn't mean online like on the internet, but online in the sense of happening over time. And so the canonical framework here would be multi-armed bandits and such generalizations. In the multi-armed bandits, you can think of it as like a causal treatment effect type setting, but you decide the treatment for a unit, then you observe the outcome, then you decide the treatment for the next unit and so on. And the goal is to maximize average outcomes over time. So you can think again, for instance, in a clinical trial, patients come in over time, and each time you have to decide what medical treatment to give to them. And your goal might be to save as many patients overall. And so these multi-armed bandits and more general online learning settings then introduce an additional dimension into machine learning, which is the trade-off between exploration and exploitation, where here exploration means the need to experiment in order to learn which treatments are actually effective or which policies are successful. And exploitation means using what you have learned, but you don't want to be at either extreme, right? You don't want to just keep running an RCT to infinity, because then even though you already know that some treatment is more effective than another, you keep using suboptimal treatments. But at the same time, you don't want it to be all in on the exploitation, because if you just always use what you think is best now, you might never try new things and might never learn that there's actually other things that are more effective. And so some combination of multi-armed bandits and targeted treatment assignment then is really at the heart of how Google and Facebook and co make their billions of dollars. which is kind of designing in an adaptive way over time what ads to show to which users in order to maximize their ad revenues. Why? All right. So this was my 10-minute version of the summary of AI and machine learning. And now let me turn kind of to the normative interpretation and to the economic framework side. But so, yeah, the key point to take away from the summary of what machine learning and AI is that they are all systems that are about maximizing some measurable and well-defined objective or reward. And they all take data as an input and produce some chosen actions as an output. All right, so now let's talk about social welfare. What is social welfare? I mean, that's a very contentious question, obviously, and one that has been debated for literally thousands of years now. But there is some commonalities to a large number of different perspectives on social justice and social welfare. And we can summarize the perspective as saying that normative statements about society are based on normative statements about the welfare of the individuals in that society. Right, so that covers a wide range of viewpoints from like very radical progressive to very conservative. It does also exclude certain frameworks, so it doesn't include like a say fascist perspective where you only care about the fate of nations or races as opposed to individuals. But most normative perspectives across the political spectrum can actually be subsumed in this. And so what the framework then implies is that we care about a certain set of individuals. We have some notion of how to measure the welfare of these individuals. I'm going to denote that VI here. And then we have some notion of how to aggregate individual welfare into a measure of social welfare. All right, so we have social welfare is some function f of the individual welfare V1 through Vn here. And I mean, this framework has a lot of bite, but it also opens a lot of questions that we can have meaningful disagreements about. But it allows us to more systematically talk about these questions. First one is, who are the individuals that are actually to be included here, which is a non-obvious one, right? So a lot of discussions explicitly or implicitly assume that this is maybe all the citizens of a country, but you might also say it should be all residents, including the non-citizens, right? Which is often a large number of people. But why stop at national borders? Why don't we care about all humans on Earth? But even there's a question: how do we think about future generations versus present generations? Should future generations be explicitly included here? And that's especially, of course, relevant when we think about big long-term questions like climate change and related issues. What about non-human life? Like, do we care about the welfare of animals for their own sake? So, first set of thorny questions. The second one is how do we measure individual welfare? So an old debate is, do we care about opportunities versus outcomes, and what does opportunity mean? We could define it in terms of utility, which is the dominant approach in economics, right? So your welfare is kind of equated to what you would choose. John Rawls, in his theory of justice, argued for some notion of resources to be the relevant measure here. He called them primary goods, right? So basic resources like education, income, political rights, which kind of then allow you to do other things you might care about in your life. Or a more comprehensive version of that Amartya Sen has argued for is to measure welfare in terms of capabilities. Kind of some comprehensive set about the choices that are effectively available to you, taking into account all economic, political, and social constraints on what you can do. And then the last set of questions here is, how do we aggregate individual welfare into the notion of social welfare? That's about the interpersonal trade-offs. How much do we care about an additional dollar or peso for a rich person versus a poor person? About a sick person versus a healthy person? Do we care about history in the sense that there's a special relevance about whether some group was a victim of historic injustices and so on? Just zooming in on the second one here, like how do we define individual welfare? The dominant approach in economics, and this thing is one that in many settings is actually a very useful one, including the settings where we talk about AI, is to think about utility in the sense of equating what what is good for people with what they would choose if they had the choice, right? So formally the framework is here, as in any micro textbook, there's some choice set CI, there's some preference, utility functions of individuals. The assumption would be that individuals choose the utility maximizing option from their effective choice set, and the realized welfare is then the maximum of utility over the choice set. And when we think about policies, and in particular algorithms somehow affecting individuals, we think about them affecting the choice set while holding the utility functional preference constant. And so what the framework essentially does is equating two things. It's equating a positive statement about what individuals would actually choose if they had the choice, with a normative statement on that's what's good for them, what they would actually choose. And there are, of course, many contexts where we might think about that that framework being limited. Like one would be, say, addictive behavior. Another one would be kind of the more long-run lifetime questions of things like, where do our aspirations come from? Say, how do we think about gendered expectations of what's an appropriate job for a man or a woman, and so on? If that's internalized, do we think about it as preferences? But that being said, I think in a lot of contexts, it's useful to focus on this, and that's opening a gap relative to a lot of machine learning systems that are also supposed to be designed for social good in some way. Where, for instance, say an algorithm in the labor market context might try to get as many people into a job as possible, but that's not the same thing as maximizing worker welfare, right? Because you can maximize the number of people who have a job by introducing a forced labor system and putting a gun to people's heads, but that's presumably not good for the well-being. And so if you think about maximizing the choice set, that gives a different normative perspective. And in terms of aggregating, so this is the kind of standard way that public finance and optimal taxation would think about this. It's useful to think about small changes here, and then we can define so-called welfare weights, omega I in my notation here, which is how much does the social welfare change as we change the welfare of individual I here a bit. So say, how much do we care about the marginal dollar for a millionaire versus a homeless person, or things like that. And here, one key point I want to emphasize, there's no objective way to pick these welfare rates, right? So this is what's reflecting the fundamental distributional conflict we face as a society, where that's not something you can answer in an empirical way, how much different people matter, but that's something that ultimately you have to take a normative stance on whose side you take in a trade-off of welfare. And that applies in particular to the impact of AI. And so, okay, so that was a very brief survey of social choice and theories of justice. Now, how do we bring the two things together, right? So I started by saying AI systems maximize some measurable objective. I'm saying normatively we care about social welfare as our objective. How do we bring one closer to the other? And so from a strategic or political perspective, that raises the question, who are the agents of change? And so more specifically, who are social agents, individuals, organizations, or groups who have the interest, like say the material interests, the values, and the capacity to move technology and policy in particular to bring social welfare and AI closer to each other. And here, what the majority of discussions on the ethics of AI presumes implicitly is that the only agents of change that matter are corporate managers and engineers. And of course, they're the ones that might have the most direct control over objectives of AI as they're set now. But as economists, we typically think, and I think to a first approximation, that the good assumption is that private corporations are profit maximizing entities. And so that might or might not be aligned with social welfare maximization. And there are many contexts where there are good reasons to think that it is not. And so if that's the case, then corporate managers and engineers are not necessarily sensible agents of change to think about here, because their interests and values are not aligned with getting the objective of AI closer to social welfare. And so instead, we might want to think about a broader democratic discourse and agents outside, whether that's like through the government and political regulation, or through pressure groups of various forms, through the media and so on, that might impact the objectives of AI maybe mediated through their impact on what is profit maximizing, for instance, through reputation management of companies or through other pressure points. But more generally, when we think about then coming up with frameworks for the regulation of AI, we should think about frameworks that allow for effective control over the objectives that are being maximized by AI by those people who are actually being impacted by those objectives. And again, this democratic control could happen at many different levels, from like the local, say, neighborhood or factory to the national to the global level. And I think we should think hard about all of these levels where we can have more democratic control. Yeah, so just to summarize that point again, different people have different objectives generically in society. And so because of that, generically, AI systems are going to generate winners and losers. And in order to assess the impact of AI systems and how to assess like different potential regulations of them, we have to think about how we trade off these individual gains and losses. So again, it was a very high level review of social choice theory, theories of justice, a little bit of political theory. And now we have to think about how we bring the two together and how are these frameworks helpful to actually think about these debates about the social impact of AI. And so for the rest of my talk then, I want to go through these 5 different domains that are being discussed. And I want to always contrast one view that I'm going to call the standard view, which, I mean, of course, there's this being a huge debate now, there's all the deviating views, but which by and large, I think is the dominant view in this debate. I'm going to contrast it with an alternate view, which is kind of informed by the framework described now, in particular, by thinking about the consequences of algorithms for social welfare and for the distribution of welfare across people. Okay, so with that, like first discussion that got a lot of attention here is discussion on fairness, discrimination, and inequality, and on algorithmic bias. And so here the computer scientists have largely followed some I think problematic frameworks that economists have pushed for many decades, which is thinking about fairness of algorithms, essentially about whether some algorithm assigns treatment in accordance to the different so-called merit of different people, right? To say, if you think about hiring, if people are hired according to their expected productivity in the sense that of their contribution to firm profits. And so another way of saying that, and that's really what's baked in also into the notion of taste-based discrimination that economists have embraced, is calling things unfair if they deviate from profit maximization, right? And so crucially, that those notions of fairness, and there are literally hundreds that are floating around, but they all have this in common, are essentially measures of deviating from profit maximization. And so that has its historic origins, I think, in like the 1960s in the US, the civil rights movement, arguing that there's vast inequalities across racial groups in the US and that those are discriminatory. And then people like Gary Becker in Chicago arguing, no, it's not discriminatory as long as it's profit maximizing, right? And that's really what's been baked into the notion of taste-based discrimination, and which is kind of perpetuated now by this notion of algorithmic fairness. So rather than encoding how well are people doing under this algorithm from the disadvantaged groups, that's not what these fairness notions are asking. They're asking is unequal treatment here justifiable based on profit maximization? Now, this contrasts with how economists in, say, public finance, optimal taxation, welfare economics, but also in program evaluation would think about these things, which is about the consequences of policies and algorithmic decisions for the distribution of welfare of different people. But I really want to emphasize this. Fairness is about justifying unequal treatment based on some notion of merit, right, to see how productive you are, whereas welfare is about the consequences, right? So it's what's happening afterwards rather than what's happening before. And it's about the welfare of different people. And so there are many contexts where these two frameworks give you different assessments. So for instance, if you think about what happens when systems become better and better at predicting, for instance, because there's more data, or there are more algorithms, or there's more computational infrastructure available, then generically what that's going to mean is that treatment is going to be more and more aligned with merit, right? So firms are going to get better and better at just hiring the workers that are going to contribute most to profits. And so that's by construction good for fairness, right? Because it's good for profit. But typically it's going to be bad for equality, because the more and more dispersed predictions get, which is what improved predictions mean, the more unequal treatment assignment becomes. Or to think about another set of changes or policies, any form of affirmative action or redistribution or a compensation for pre-existing inequalities is by construction bad for fairness according to these notions, because it's an unequal treatment, unequal allocation of resources that's not rationalized based on merit, but that's rationalized based on compensating for pre-existing inequalities, which therefore is good for equality, but bad for fairness. So the point here is those are two really different normative frameworks, and economists are somewhat schizophrenic between the two. I would argue that when we talk about algorithmic fairness and algorithmic bias, we should put much more emphasis on this consequentialist welfare perspective, where we ask, what is the effect of an algorithmic decision-making system, like a hiring system, a student admission system, a bail setting system, medical treatment allocation system? What is the effect of such a system on the distribution of welfare across people in the context of pre-existing inequalities? So that's one debate, the debate about fairness. Another one is the discussion about privacy and data property rights and data governance. There, again, let me start with what I call a standard view here. So in computer science, there's a very well-developed literature on what's called differential privacy. And it's a very kind of mathematically elegant and coherent framework. And the definition of differential privacy that they employ in a nutshell says that basically it should make no difference for any individual whether their data are included in a data set or not. And that has to be true in a very uniform sense. It has to be true no matter what other information is available to a decision maker. And this notion, in some sense, is a response to more naive notions of privacy that are often employed, right? So there is, for instance, people might think if I remove sensitive information from a data set, like their individual names or their birth date or social security numbers, then that's making the data private. But it's easy to show that even with very kind of neutral seeming information, like what breakfast you had for the last few days, chances are I can pinpoint who you are exactly based on auxiliary information. And so differential privacy is the answer to that. That's really the coherent notion of privacy, in the sense that I cannot detect who's in the data, no matter what additional information I have. And now an intriguing feature of this notion of privacy is that machine learning performance for many applications is essentially unaffected by differential privacy, right? So there's a lot of mathematical results to that effect. And it's kind of intuitive, right? So if you think about the most basic machine learning problem, let's say regressing some outcome Y on some covariance X, what they care about is the beta of this regression, right? So the coefficient beta on the axis in predicting Y. But you don't care about whether some particular individuals, YI and XI, are in the data set or not. And so what this is saying here then is I can do any form of learning. I can learn all the betas arbitrarily well, even though I have somehow masked which individuals are in the data set. So even though I maintain differential privacy. And now that ties then into another debate more from the legal side, where a number of people in reform attempts now argue that we should have individual property rights over our data. Right, so currently in the commercial context, it's essentially the Wild West in many settings, where companies can collect anything about you and you have no control about that. Now people argue, well, we need individual property rights where you decide who gets your data or not, and you have a right to delete your data and so on. But what this is saying is individuals have no incentive to withhold your data in such a regime as long as differential privacy is guaranteed. right? Differential privacy means it has no consequence whether your data included. So as long as you get a little bit of reward for sharing your data, you're going to be willing to do it from a self-interested perspective. But any downstream consequences of machine learning are still going to be taking place. Or to put this in more economic terminology, excuse me. Acemoglu and others have called this so-called data externalities or informational externalities. So another way of putting that is that the purpose of learning is to learn patterns across individuals, right? So it's to learn the relationship between the Ys and the X's. It's not about learning the individual Ys and the X's. And so what then is kind of a corollary of this is that privacy and property rights can do nothing to prevent downstream harms from AI. On the flip side of that, it's there can also, with privacy and property rights, we can also not coordinate to get downstream benefits of AI that might exist. And so really, because in some sense, the externality is the point here, individual level solutions are not going to cut it. And we need some more forms of more collective democratic governance of data and data collection to address harms and benefits of AI. And we cannot just solve them using individual level property rights. Third debate that's gotten a lot of attention is the debate about so-called value alignment. So that's something that, as I mentioned, Silicon Valley guys love to talk about, and often what they have in mind is some kind of science fiction scenario, like Space Odyssey, where there's like the hero is on a spaceship with the computer hell, and then they start fighting against each other, and so it's man versus machine, or Terminator, or there are many other Hollywood movies with kind of a similar theme. And so the Silicon Valley guys then love to talk about the existential risks of AI, combining this with an idea of somehow superhuman capabilities of AI and conflict between man and machine, which leads to the existential risks. And so then from that perspective, where it's really just a conflict between man versus machine, typically it's a man in their scenarios, is to somehow be more careful about how you engineer the objective of the algorithm, right? To make sure that what the algorithm is maximizing is really what the human cares about. And a variation of that some people in also more academic discussions about AI have pushed is methods like so-called inverse reinforcement learning, which incidentally is very similar to what economists have done under the header of dynamic discrete choice estimation, is to essentially infer human preferences from human behavior and then use these inferred preferences as the objective for machine learning algorithms. And this is often kind of sold in very flowery language, like calling this provably safe AI and things like that. Now, the alternate view that I'm arguing for here is, again, in the typical scenarios we care about, it's not a conflict between a human and a machine. It's, in terms of their objectives, it's a conflict between the objectives of those who control the algorithm and the rest of society, right? So when Facebook says causing filter bubbles and promoting political violence or teenage mental health issues and so on, that's not because there's somehow an optimization error that happens or somehow an error in measuring the reward. That's by design, because the goal is to maximize ad clicks, which includes maximizing engagement. And so that's not an optimization error, that's a conflict of interest between what's in the interest of those who own Facebook and the rest of society. And so we have to, it's really an alignment problem between different parts of society and not an alignment problem between humans and machines. And relatedly and additionally, in many settings, actually not everything we care about is observable. And so that imposes fundamental limits on optimization, which again is something that economic theorists have actually emphasized when you think about in particular mechanism design and contract theory, and more specifically models of so-called multitasking. Then there are many settings where not everything you care about is measurable. And that has often been used as an explanation for why we actually don't observe high-powered monetary incentives in private sector jobs, say, because it would be a bad idea, right? So if you put large monetary rewards for measurable objectives, then that often distorts behavior from things that we care about, but that are not directly measurable. And so if you have such observability constraints, then sometimes there are fundamental limits in terms of what you can do by optimization or the human analog of contract design, what you can do by monetary incentives. And so you might have to refrain from using AI systems in the same way that you might have to refrain from using high-powered incentives in say, labor contracts. And yeah, again, the solution for the value alignment problem is, again, democratic control of the objectives and the resources for maximizing them, rather than some from a provably safe AI that gets man and machine to agree. Yet another debate is the debate about so-called explainability and accountability. And that's something that both philosophers and people in law have put quite some attention to, which is the question of which algorithmic decisions can be explained. So say I apply for a job and then I don't get it because the algorithm said no, then many people have argued I have a right to know why did the algorithm deny me and not deny another person. And now that's a difficult notion for a number of reasons. For one, typically questions of why are not very well defined, right? So if we compare it to how we think about causal inference in econometrics, in causal inference, we typically ask what if questions. So what if you got treatment or not? What would have happened? But not if you have a certain outcome, why did this outcome happen? Because there's kind of an infinite regress of possible causes you could list. And the other thorny issue here is explainability is then typically related to a question of simplicity, that somehow the mapping from inputs to outputs has to be simple enough to be understood by humans, as opposed to, say, a very complicated neural net where who knows what's happening in there. And so this question of explainability is then often related to a question of accountability, which means who is accountable for an algorithmic decision, especially if it's complicated and cannot be directly explained. Now, what I would contrast this view with is a view that we don't necessarily need to explain individual decisions. What we need to understand and have a discussion about is what it is that the algorithm is maximizing, so what the objectives are. And I think that's a very useful reframe, because in some sense it makes it a lot simpler, right? So I can talk about whether or not Facebook is maximizing ad clicks, and that's in some sense a discussion that I can have with many people. And in order to do that, I don't need to understand like how the specific neural nets that they're using are structured, or the transformers, or what specific weights they're using, and so on. Instead, it's a discussion about what kind of the choice of actions that the algorithm has, what is it trying to maximize. And once I know that, there is algorithmic details about how I get there in this optimization. But really what I care about from a societal perspective is what it is that's being maximized. And I think the reframing in that way, that opens the public debate about AI much more broadly, where we can kind of refute this technocratic argument, oh, this is very complicated, leave it to the specialists, leave it to the technocrats, only the corporate engineers understand what's going on and nobody else has the right to talk about it, and move it into the domain where we can say, no, this, at the end of the day, it's not that complicated. You're running an optimization, the optimization is maximizing something, and as a society, we can talk about, do we want to maximize ad clicks, or do we want to maximize the contribution of profits of hired workers, or do we want to maximize something else? And so I think this translation then opens the space for democratic control, and radically simplifies what we have to talk about when we talk about algorithms, rather than restricting attention to a very limited class of simple decision functions, where again, simple is a moving target in a way. Like a linear regression might be simple to somebody who has had a few years of economics training. It's not maybe not simple to a lawyer or who doesn't have the training or something like that, and let alone something much more complicated, like say deep neural network. And the last debate that I wanted to address today before concluding and hopefully opening the discussion is the debate about automation, wage inequality. So of the 5 debates I'm mentioning here, that's the one that's taking place more within economics. And the typical framework that in some form or other, most of this literature has in mind is like a production function framework. Right, so where the idea is there's some total output, and that output is a function of the inputs. For instance, how many workers you have, what capital you're using, and what technology you're using. And under some assumptions about competitive labor markets and wage setting, you might then have that wages are equal to the slope of this production function, so equal to the marginal productivity of workers. And what that framework then allows you to think about is what happens as we move technology around, new technologies arise. For instance, new AI methods. And one thing you might be worried about, and that Mogul and others have been, and that David Autor and so on have been worried about, is versions of this where we have technical progress without shared prosperity, which within the kind of standard neoclassical framework is very, very possible, right? So you might have a technology that increases output but decreases marginal productivity. And the reason is like increasing output means essentially shifting the intercept, shifting the entire production function up, but marginal productivity is about the slope, it's not about the intercept. And so it might well be that there are technologies that favor automation, that increase production overall, but decrease marginal productivity of workers, essentially by replacing them by machines, and therefore making the workers worse off, decreasing their incomes, decreasing their employment prospects, and increasing social inequality overall. And so there's nothing inherent here about any technology, whether it should go one way or the other, whether it should lead to more or less shared prosperity. And so that's something that really depends on control, right? How and what technology is used to what end in the production process depends on who makes the decisions about which technology to use, which then impacts whose economic interests are being served by these decisions. And so there's a lot to be said there about questions like worker co-determination impacting the trajectory of technological choices. And so I think this is a useful and interesting framework, but at the same time, it's a little bit of a blunt framework to think about AI, because there's nothing here that makes AI different from, say, the steam engine or electricity or any other important technology of the last 200 years. And I think that, as I've tried to emphasize throughout this talk, AI is something that's a lot more specific. It's about methods for optimizing rewards by choosing actions based on available data. And so that then again opens the political economy question of who chooses the objectives, who controls the data, who controls the hardware and software to do the optimization, which incidentally I've talked less about here today, but also has a lot of international dimensions, right? So, I mean, in practice, the answer is a bunch of corporations that are de facto headquartered in Silicon Valley, which very much might not be the players whose interests align with the countries in the global south. So there's a question of technological self-determination here, right? And again, this is not inherent to AI. Like, there's nothing about AI that says you have to maximize one objective or the other, but it's about the social arrangement of who uses the technology to what end. All right, summarizing, there's a lot of different issues that are being debated and that are being raised by AI, issues related to fairness, to privacy, to value alignment, to accountability, to automation, and to other topics that I haven't touched on. I have argued that resolving these issues requires democratic control of algorithm objectives, and in order to get there, democratic control over the means to obtain them, including data and computational infrastructure. And to get towards democratic control, we need to have a broad public debate and a public understanding about what these systems are doing and that they're optimizing systems and what they're optimizing. And we need to have binding collective decision-making at many different levels of society. And I guess the way I think about the role of academics and all this in particular is in some sense doing this translation work and explaining the ultimate simplicity of these systems in order to then enable this public debate, rather than keeping it to a small technocratic elite who controls it, and to make the case that it's too complicated for the wider public to discuss about. And with that statement, let me stop and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Maximilian, for your provocative presentation. I really like it, and in particular, I like it, the blue, when you put the terms, the words in blue, those are the keys of your presentations. We would like to have some questions from the audience. We have one there.
Thank you, Maximilian. It was a fascinating talk. I would like you to comment on, well, I know that machine learning techniques and AI are being used as we speak for choosing the targets of missiles in the different kind of wars that we are experiencing now. And so my question, you already kind of discussed part of the topic, but you know, when we talk about democratic control, the question is, are we really able to democratically control such technology? Because I mean, it's too much power in the hands of just a few. And there is a kind of question about, is it credible that we can control it?
Yeah, completely with you. And I mean, you raised obviously a horrific example of how AI actually already is being used in a military context. I mean, my answer would be, is it possible? I mean, in some sense, that's not specific to AI, right? That's like relates to many different questions. And you say, like, I mean, there's also many dimensions, like international power imbalances and whose lives matter and so on. I think we should try, and I think it's not a 1 or 0 thing. I think democratic control means, in practice, there are many different potential actors, groups, organizations, individuals who have different levels of power. And we should think about how we get to a point where control over these objectives is more broadly shared, and maybe not just controlled by a small number of private corporations or militaries of rich countries. Is it possible? I don't know. We have to try, I guess.
We have another question there.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation and the framework. It was really useful. Just let me push you a bit more on the same direction with a different example. I hate Genshin Impact, which is a popular game that my daughter plays like 8 to 10 hours a day. And it's an incredible algorithm designed to maximize the number of hours that the children are gonna spend on the phone. The company, I guess, is in China. So my question would be, how do you attempt to regulate such a complex, I don't know, web of interactions? Is how me as a Bolivian living in Washington would regulate an algorithm that is created by someone in China and is marketed in the US by some tech company. And related to that is, like, it's not better to have like a market that, like, market competition as the best way to regulate algorithm and to maybe aim for something more equally distributed, because again, thinking about like governments and the quality of many of our governments in the world and local governments, I don't know if there is a potential there, like to make them conscious of all what's behind machine learning. Sorry for taking too much time.
Like I hear like sometimes there's two questions, right? Like to what extent is like can markets answer these questions? I think in practice, right? I mean, I don't know if you want to call it market, right? I mean, you have Google and Facebook more or less, and they control a vast amount of this. Maybe some Chinese companies now too. And essentially most of these big tech platforms are designed to undermine any form for competition, right? So there's all these discussions about interoperability. I mean, in principle, we could force them to have their standards open to say you can switch your social network and still connect to your friends and followers in the other network and so on. And so I think there's something to be said about that in terms of decentralizing power and spreading it more broadly, right? Where you can switch off of, say, a given social network if what they're doing gets too problematic in one way or another. I think that can answer some questions in terms of concentrated power and in terms of being too big to jail and so on, but not others. You know, as I've been trying to emphasize in the talk, there's a lot of issues like where in essence the whole point of AI is the externality, right? And so any individual level decisions are not, and say market mediated decisions are not going to be able to address any of these externalities that are kind of the essence of learning. And relatedly, there's all the kind of more distributional questions where, again, I mean, there's no reason whether the market allocation should align with what we care about as a society from a distribution point of view. Now, how to regulate, say, across countries and companies and so on. I mean, I don't have a set answer for that, but it's not like there's no way to regulate things that are being produced in another country, right? I mean, there's many things you can do at the border. You can, I mean, again, taking the climate change example, there's things like border adjustment for carbon taxes and so on. And yeah, I mean, it's a good question and one that we have to think hard about, but I don't think it's impossible.
We have another question there, Max.
Yeah, my question is slightly related. It seems like the equity concerns of things like bail or sentencing or even job offers or first order, but it wasn't as clear to me what externalities we should be concerned about when we think about AI and private consumer goods like smartwatches or Amazon recommendations. Could you speak more about that?
I mean, there's many examples there too, right? So depends on what regulatory restrictions there are, and Amazon is careful to not get monopoly lawsuits, so they squeeze their producers and they're more careful on the consumer side because that's the more protected side as it stands. But in principle, the externality there conceptually would be learning price elasticities. And I mean, that's essentially what Amazon actually spends most of their AI on, is like learning consumer demand and like giant cross elasticities of demand systems in order to then do optimal pricing to squeeze out maximum of monopoly rent at the end of the day. And that's on the producer side, they are doing that completely. On the consumer side, they are hemmed in by regulation and doing that. But the externality then is, say, you and me are similar in some important respect, and then they raise the price for me and see I still buy the good and I don't drop out, then they know, then they learn that my price elasticity is low. Therefore, they learn that your price elasticity is low because you're similar to me, and therefore they raise your price. Right, so that's the externality here. Or with smartwatches, they were like a collection of health data, like especially in a context where you have private health insurance, then learning who's at risk for what. Say the smartwatch keeps completely private my behavior and health risks in the sense of differential privacy, but I have nothing to fear in terms of sharing my data. But then they learn that certain things are risk factors, and then they as a consequence, if it excludes certain groups of the population from health insurance or raise the premium and so on, would again be a typical example of this type of data externality. And I mean, you can come up with an endless list of those if you think about it.
Thanks. I'm interested in, you coordinate this machine learning and economics group. Can you tell us about how do you function? And why don't you have political sciences there? Because your recommendation is to democratize the usage of AI. And we are, as economists, we don't really know that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so how does the group function? I mean, to be honest, it's me. No, but the various things I've been doing, where I'm teaching machine learning to economists, like more the statistical theory of it. There's the reading group we're running every term, where I'm trying to pick different topics every term to kind of hit that intersection between the technical aspect of it and the social normatively relevant aspect. And so there's kind of been a varying set of people who have been participating in it. I've had a lot of interest from graduate students and other faculty, and I've actively reached out against people in other departments, including other social sciences, and I've had some participation there. But it's work in progress to build the whole thing, I suppose. I mean, I would like to hire more people in that field, but resources are always scarce in academic departments.
But are you becoming a focal point to think about machine learning or AI with this group in the university?
I mean, there's a lot of people who come to the discussions, and I mean, I'm organizing conferences every year, and there's been a lot of people coming to those, and other graduate students from other universities in the United Kingdom have come and so on. So in that sense, yes, but in the sense of like being institutionally established, I mean, I don't have any money to run it, right? It's really just me doing it. But
the same story here. Huh? Yeah. And I wonder if there is another question. I wonder how the university, the place you are, is taking this new weapon, as the missile, as Alfonso says, are on the defensive side with the artificial intelligence, or let's say here some people are concerned about that the students are not going to work anymore, and others are more happy that they say, well, this is a new tool that we can use. And I will say that is half and half. And what is your take there?
So I mean, in terms of how teaching works, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of discussions ongoing, and it's not settled. I think. I mean, my personal opinion is we've had the same discussions about pocket calculators like 30 years ago. I don't think it harms student math learning to have pocket calculators. I think in the same way, having language-based tools doesn't need to be a harm. We probably have to change about what we're focusing the education on. But it's not like it's less relevant to teach multiplication tables now to students because, yeah, we can easily outsource that, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other skills we should teach. In terms of how they, I don't know, I guess you said missiles and how the university interacts with it. I mean, there's a broader question here of what public funding there is for these things, and I find it somewhat problematic. So the UK has this big Turing Institute, but really what the current UK government likes to fund is exactly kind of more military-related applications and things like, I mean, literally finding out undocumented migrants in an automated way or monitoring on political discourse to control it, which I definitely want to not get involved with. But that's what there is money for from the public side now.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Well, we really thank you. We believe that this is going to be our first contact. We will be bugging you because we are going to create a center here with similar issues, but more open to other social science and humanities.
That sounds great.
But we'll be in touch.
Happy to stay in touch.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Bye-bye. Thank you.